Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about kind of recapping briefly from Clinton to present day. So we're just going to run through the last handful of presidents because this is more current events than true history. But nonetheless, we're going to run through it just so we have an understanding of the last little bit up until today. So Bill Clinton was a governor of state before he became president, and he's going to see George Bush at a particular point of weakness. And even though he's a young man, for a politician running for president, he's going to see Bush and see a period of weakness, and he's going to pounce. And he's going to do very successfully. Ross Perot actually pulls a lot of the Republican vote away from Bush. So Clinton is able to secure enough electoral votes to win the election. Now, Clinton's presidency is one of a lot of tumult and a lot of issues, particularly domestically. But let's talk foreign issues at first. So there's an ethnic cleansing in Bosnia Herzegovina that the UN kind of delays going into, but eventually we have to send troops in. And we realize we waited too long, the United Nations waited too long, and it was a pretty bad situation by the time we actually arrived. You see it again shortly thereafter in Kosovo, but this time we tried to go in, the UN tried to go in earlier to try to kind of head off the worst of these ethnic cleansings. But later on in other places like Rwanda, we don't go in at all, the UN doesn't go in at all, and it gets real bad. So we have some efforts trying to prevent things like the Holocaust from happening or the Armenian genocide, but it's not perfect. So he's having to deal with some of these foreign issues that aren't ideal. Now, he runs for re-election and wins. So you have Clinton and Gore running for re-election. They win a pretty solid margin, particularly in the Electoral College. So Ross Perot runs again. He's a Texas billionaire. But much of Bill Clinton's presidency is defined by this age of domestic terrorism. So you have in Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidians. It's a cult that is heavily armed, and the government's trying to disarm them, and they send forces in and a fire breaks out in the effort to disarm them, and it goes really bad. A bunch of people die. It wasn't the government's most glorious moment trying to disarm a potentially dangerous cult. But nonetheless, actually the cult still persists today, and they still have this land outside of Waco, Texas. And yeah, so they didn't even get rid of the cult, they just caused a big fire and cost some people their lives. So you can see kind of the remnants of the compound. Then you have Timothy McVeigh. On the second anniversary of the Waco raid, Timothy McVeigh drove a truck into the street in front of the Oklahoma City federal office building, and he blew up the truck in the front of the building. It collapsed the entire front of this 9-story building, killing 169 people. Then you have the Unabomber, who had been active since 1978, but the first fatality began in 1985. He targeted universities and airlines. Now, he wrote a manifesto called Industrial Society and Its Future, arguing that traditional Western culture and its tradition of consumption are going to destroy our world. So he thought the airlines and universities were propagating this idea, and he targeted them. So the first fatality was in 1985, and he was finally caught in 1996, with his last bombing being in Sacramento, California in 1995. Now, more pressing for us is the Columbine shooting high school, or Columbine High School shooting. So, two young men decided to go into Littleton, Colorado, the Columbine High School, and kill 12 classmates, a teacher, and then finally themselves. And this starts this strange trend of gun-wielding mass shootings in schools. So it's something that still is happening. And this is a new phenomenon just in the past 2 or 3 decades that we're not 100% sure what causes it. We think that's a lot of reasons, but we're not quite sure. Then you have an escalation of the war on drugs. So you have 3 strikes and you're out as a new kind of general law. So you get 2 minor crimes, then the 3rd crime, you get the maximum sentence for it. So it could be very minor things, but the 3rd one might have you in prison for a long period of time. And this is marking the beginning of kind of industrialized prisons, so private prisons that we'll talk more about later. And you can see federal prisoner population is going to jump massively, and this is way more than like a proportional increase for our population. There are more prisoners in US prisons, percentage-wise, per capita-wise, than any other nation in the world. And it's not because we're more violent. The United States is safer than most other countries. But it's the way we have our laws structured, particularly drug laws, that are causing this escalation, this jump in federal prison population, and also the development of privatized prisons. Now, this drug war is a very unique thing. It's something we have forced on much of the rest of the world, particularly Mexico and Central and South America, that supply most of the drugs, because the United States outlaws the drugs, but then it consumes majority of the drugs produced in all these other countries. So we are the problem on both sides. Now, what the solution is, that's more complex. But nonetheless, this is a big problem that's leading to our prison system, leading to organized crime. There's a lot of money in it, and it seems to be all going into the hands of criminals. Then Bill Clinton gets hit with a bit of a scandal. Apparently, he had sexual relations with his intern, Monica Lewinsky. They put him on trial for impeachment for lying under oath or perjury. Now, it's a close vote, but ultimately he does not get impeached, but it kind of tarnishes his reputation of what had been a relatively good presidency. So his vice president, Al Gore, will run for president against George W. Bush. So Bush is going to be one of the few second generation presidents. So you have Adams and John Quincy Adams. Now you're going to have George H.W. Bush and then George W. Bush. Now there's a lot of contention in this one because of Florida. Florida used this weird punch ballot system that didn't fully mark everything correctly. So you have poor guys like this one having to count and recount these ballots time and time again. But ultimately, Bush wins the presidency. It's extremely close, but Bush does win. He is sworn in as president, and very quickly, his presidency takes a turn. The terrorist attacks on 9/11 began to be the defining aspect of Bush's presidency. So the Twin Towers were hit, the Pentagon was attacked, and a 3rd plane, which was going somewhere, we're not 100% sure, but the passengers managed to crash that plane on their own before it got to whatever its intended target was. This starts a war on terror. Now, this war on terror is an interesting thing because terror is not something you can kill. It's an abstract concept. But nonetheless, we start this war on terror. We get things like the Patriot Act, which dramatically extend the government's ability to kind of root out terrorism, but in doing so also encroaches on many American freedoms such as privacy. And they're going to have access to many American kind of private things like our email, phone records, our internet histories, all these kinds of things are going to start being recorded at a far greater rate than ever before. We actually go in overseas. Several Middle Eastern countries are going to be invaded as a result of 9/11. We overthrow the government in Iraq, taking Saddam Hussein out of power because we suspect him of having weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be somewhat of a dubious claim. You have, on domestic issues, you have the Columbia blowing up on efforts to leave the atmosphere. This is one of the last efforts that NASA made to launch its own ship into space. Shortly after this, we would end our space program, at least running our own spaceships. We would use Russian ships, and then today we actually use private companies to fly our astronauts up to the space station. Bush ran against John Kerry and managed to win re-election, but his second term was tarnished by his handling of Hurricane Katrina. Many people criticized him for having a racist approach and not caring enough, because most of the people hurt during the Katrina were African Americans. So whether that's true or not is up for debate, but nonetheless the response was lackluster and not very quick for the rebuilding and aid to New Orleans. And right as Bush was leaving office, a Great Recession was hitting the US economy, which we'll talk more about in a second. The next presidential race is going to be Barack Obama going against John McCain. Now, a young black candidate for the Democrats is a strong ticket. McCain needed a trump card, so he turned to Sarah Palin, a young white woman from Alaska who was governor, is going to be his running mate. So he's hoping that will be enough to kind of balance the ticket. Ultimately, Obama manages to swing the win, and he becomes the first African American president in United States history. Now, this Great Recession that I alluded to a second ago, this had to do with the housing market being over leveraged and people getting loans too easily to buy various properties. And this is going to collapse, and it's going to tank the stock market, and Obama is going to have to try to deal with this. And to various degrees, he succeeds or fails. One of the big issues Obama said he was going to do was just close Guantanamo Bay. So this is Guantanamo, that piece of Cuba, that bay in Cuba that we owned and we were using to hold terrorists or suspected terrorists during the Bush administration. He said he was going to close it. They tried. It kept getting delayed, and unfortunately it's still open with some people still being detained there. He starts a new clean energy initiative, trying to shift the United States to a greater percentage of clean energy, getting away from oil and gas and coal. The biggest issue is Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. Now, when questioned, many Americans are like, oh, I love the Affordable Care Act. When asked they like Obamacare, they're like, no, I hate that. So ideological lines are already being drawn during this time based on like what you call something, much less what the product actually does, or what the act actually does. This is an effort to give all Americans affordable health care. It was moderately successful. It was a better system than what we had before, but there were huge flaws and errors in its execution. Now, during Obama's second term, he's going to finish something that President Bush started. They are going to manage to kill Osama bin Laden, the man who claimed credit for the attacks of 9/11. He will be assassinated by US forces, ending one of the longest manhunts in US history. Now, in this process, Obama has kind of withdrawn some of our troops from our Middle Eastern endeavors, but in replacement has upped drone strikes, which has also upped many of the civilian casualties. So while there's some benefits to what Obama did in the Middle East, there's also some kind of issues that arose as well. So Obama ran again and will get reelected. And during his second term, he's going to push for a support for the case of Obergefell v. Hodges, and this is for gay marriage. So he's going to throw his support behind gay marriage. And gay marriage becomes legal in the United States as a result of this. This is a huge progressive step forward for the United States. And it's something that many Americans felt was far overdue. One of the more interesting things that Obama did was reach out to Cuba, something that had not been done for decades, ever since John F. Kennedy was president, and we placed an embargo on Cuba. This is the first time we've reached out, had meetings with the Cuban leader, and trying to kind of ease some of the tensions with Cuba. Then, in 2016, you have Donald Trump, the unlikely candidate, kind of the dark horse, running against Hillary Clinton. What everyone thought was a surefire and sure in for the win. Turned out, Trump managed to win. He rallied support from people that don't normally vote and took a surprising win. And he has been a very interesting president, to say the least, very unconventional in many of his tactics and skills and strategies, but nonetheless, he had his term as president, with probably the single most defining aspect of his presidency being in the past year with the coronavirus and this worldwide pandemic that has derailed the economy and society of the whole globe. Most recently, you have Trump running for re-election against Joe Biden, which, as it stands now, Biden is the president-elect. We will see shortly if he becomes president. By the time you're watching this, we will know if he has become president. Now, if you look at the United States today, this is a map of the United States at night. You can still see most of the settlement is in the east with a little bit in the west coast, with this kind of vast open area in the middle of the Great Plains. But we think back to where we started this class after the Civil War, with very little of the country being settled, most of the country being rural, very little education going around, lots of health issues, with old white men holding most of the power. The United States in 2020 and 2021 is a drastically different world than what it was just 150, 170 years ago. So we have made huge progress. We have a long way to go. It's one of the best things about America, about the Constitution. It's an aspirational document. And it's up to each of us to keep pushing that document, to keep pushing society towards what we feel is justice, what we feel is the right path. So if you don't like the way things are going, you have to get out, you have to vote, you have to run for political office, you have to take action. Because if you just sit at home and complain, nothing's ever going to change. You have to get off Twitter, get off your computer and your phone, and go do something. So I hope you take from this class at least a little bit of this history, so you know when people are trying to use history to their advantage. You have to be able to call bullshit on them whenever they're using it inappropriately, whenever they're misusing it, whenever they're providing alternative facts. There are only one set of facts, and you need to know them so you can better face the world around you. Well, thank you for being in our class. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you around.